The night I opened the Bible, I wasn't looking for Jesus. I was looking for an answer to a question I had been carrying quietly for years, a question I was almost afraid to say out loud. If Jesus was truly sent by God, then who was he? I was 29 years old, born and raised in America, and I had always considered myself a Muslim. My faith had been part of my identity for as long as I could remember. I believed in one God. I prayed. I respected Jesus. I knew him as Isa, a great prophet and messenger of God. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I had always wondered about him. Why did Christians love Jesus with such extraordinary devotion? Why did his name appear again and again throughout history? Why had his life changed millions of people? And why did Christians speak about him not merely as a teacher, but as the center of their entire faith? For years, I avoided those questions until one rainy Thursday night in October. That was the night everything changed. My name is Laila Khan, and this is the story of how I discovered something about Jesus that I had never truly understood before. I grew up in a Muslim family in America. My childhood wasn't dramatic. There were no secret identities or forbidden friendships. We were simply a family trying to live our faith while navigating ordinary American life. My father taught me that honesty mattered more than reputation. And both of them taught me that God sees what is inside a person's heart. Jesus was never a forbidden name in our home. In fact, I remember my mother mentioning him when I was a child. She told me that Jesus was one of God's great messengers. She told me about Mary. She told me that Jesus performed miracles by God's permission. I admired him, but I never felt that I needed to know more. The matter was simple. Jesus was a prophet. A very important prophet, but still a prophet. Then, during my late 20s, something changed. I began working at a small community center where people from different religious backgrounds frequently gathered. There were Muslims, Christians, Jews, atheists, Hindus, and people who simply didn't know what they believed. One of my closest coworkers was a Christian woman named Sarah. That was one of the reasons I liked her. One afternoon, we were sitting in the break room drinking coffee when she asked me something that caught me completely off guard. "Layla, can I ask you a personal question?" "Sure. What do you believe about Jesus?" I smiled. "I'm Muslim. I believe he's a prophet." She nodded. "I know. Then why are you asking?" She looked at me for a moment. "Because I wonder if you've ever actually read what Christians believe about him." "Of course I know what Christians believe." She smiled. "Knowing about something and actually reading it for yourself aren't always the same thing." That sentence stayed with me. I didn't tell her that it bothered me, but it did. That evening, when I got home, I found myself thinking about it. Had I ever actually studied the Christian scriptures? Not heard someone explain them? Not watched a debate? Not listened to someone criticize Christianity? Had I actually opened the Bible and read the words for myself? The answer was no. And suddenly, I felt uncomfortable. Not because I thought my faith was wrong, but because I realized something. I had formed an opinion about a book I had never seriously studied. I had a Bible in my apartment. Sarah had given it to me months earlier. It was sitting on a shelf untouched. That night I walked over to it. I picked it up. For several seconds, I just stared at the cover. I almost put it back. Then I remembered what my mother had always told me. You don't have to be afraid of honest questions. So I opened it. I began with the Gospel of Matthew. I expected to find things that would confirm what I already believed. Instead, I found something much more complicated. Jesus was constantly talking about God. He prayed. He taught people to forgive. He spoke about mercy. He challenged hypocrisy. He cared about the poor. He touched the lives of people everyone else had rejected. And as I continued reading, something unexpected happened. I began to admire him more than I ever had before. Not because I suddenly believed everything I was reading, but because Jesus seemed intensely focused on God. His teachings were filled with urgency. Repent, forgive, love, give. Do not be consumed by wealth. Do not judge others while ignoring your own faults. Care for the suffering. Seek God. I kept reading. Then I reached the story of Jesus praying. I stopped. I read it again. Then again. I sat back in my chair. I wasn't reading about Jesus as a distant historical figure. I was seeing a man praying to God. And that raised a question. If Jesus prayed, whom was he praying to? I couldn't answer it immediately. I closed the Bible. That night I couldn't sleep. For the next few days, The question followed me everywhere. At work, in the car, at the grocery store, even while I was praying. I didn't tell anyone. I was afraid people would misunderstand. If I asked a Christian, they might assume I was secretly becoming Christian. If I asked a Muslim, they might assume I was doubting Islam. But I wasn't trying to abandon anything. I was trying to understand. So I started studying. I read about Jesus from Christian sources, then Muslim sources, then historical sources. I watched lectures. I read arguments. I wrote questions in a notebook. At the top of the first page, I wrote, "Who was Jesus?" Underneath, I wrote, "Prophet, Messiah, Son of God, something else." The more I studied, the more complicated everything became. But one thing became clear. Jesus was not a minor figure. He had transformed human history. People had followed him at enormous personal cost. People had died claiming loyalty to him. People had changed their lives because of his teachings. People had built entire communities around his message. I began asking myself, what was it about this man? Then I came across something that changed the direction of my research. Jesus wasn't merely talking about religious rituals. He was talking about the human heart. That frightened me, because I realized I could perform religious actions while still carrying anger, pride, jealousy, and fear inside me. Jesus' teachings seemed to expose the parts of me I preferred to hide. A few weeks later, Sarah noticed that something had changed. We were sitting outside after work. She looked at me. "You've been thinking about Jesus." I froze. She laughed. "Because every time someone mentions religion, you suddenly become very quiet." I looked down. "I've been reading." "The Bible?" "Yes." She didn't celebrate. She didn't say, "I told you so." She simply asked, "What did you discover?" I took a breath. "I discovered that I didn't know Jesus as well as I thought I did." She nodded. "That can be a powerful realization." I looked at her. "But I still don't understand something." "What?" "Why do Christians believe Jesus is more than a prophet?" She became quiet. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Don't believe it because I tell you. Read the gospel accounts. Ask the question honestly. And if you pray, ask God to guide you toward truth, not toward the answer you already want." I went home that evening thinking about her words. That night, for the first time in my life, I prayed about Jesus specifically. I didn't use complicated words. I simply said, "God, you know my heart. I don't want to follow an idea just because I inherited it. If I misunderstand Jesus, show me. If I misunderstand you, show me. I only want the truth." Then I went to sleep. That night, I had a strange dream. I was standing in an enormous empty room. There were no walls that I could see, no doors, no windows, just light. Then I heard someone speaking. I couldn't see the person, but I heard the words, "Don't be afraid to seek." I woke up immediately. My heart was pounding. I looked at the clock. 3:17 a.m. I sat on the edge of my bed. I knew it had been a dream. I wasn't going to pretend it was a supernatural message, but emotionally, it affected me. Because I realized something. I had been afraid, not of Jesus, not of Christians. I had been afraid of discovering that I might have misunderstood something important. So I opened the Bible again. This time I read more slowly. I wasn't searching for arguments. I was searching for the person behind the arguments. As the weeks passed, I began to notice something. Jesus constantly directed people toward God. He spoke about mercy when people demanded punishment. He spoke about humility when people wanted status. He spoke about forgiveness when people wanted revenge. And then I reached the accounts of his suffering. I had heard the story before, but I had never really allowed myself to sit with it. Jesus was betrayed, abandoned, mocked, beaten, and eventually crucified, according to the Christian gospel accounts. I closed the book. My eyes were filled with tears. I wasn't crying because I had suddenly become Christian. I was crying because I was seeing something I had previously reduced to a theological disagreement. A human being suffering, a person being rejected, a teacher who had spent his life speaking about mercy, being treated with cruelty. I asked myself, why would someone willingly endure that? Then another thought came. Perhaps this is why Christians love him so deeply. They weren't simply admiring a teacher. They believed his suffering meant something enormous. They believed his death was connected to humanity's reconciliation with God. And that idea was difficult for me. Very difficult. For months, I wrestled with the Christian understanding of the cross. I didn't accept everything immediately. I couldn't. I was still Muslim. I still believed in one God. I still believed Jesus was God's messenger. But I couldn't ignore what I was discovering. I met another Christian woman at the community center. Her name was Grace. One evening I asked her, "Why does the cross matter so much to you?" She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "Because I believe God doesn't abandon people in their suffering." I looked confused. She continued, "When I look at Jesus, I see a God who reaches into human suffering rather than remaining distant from it." I thought about that for a long time. Then I asked, "But why would God need the cross?" She smiled gently. "That is a question Christians have answered in different ways throughout history. For me, the deepest part isn't merely understanding every theological detail. It's understanding what the cross tells me about God's love. What does it tell you? That love can cost something." I looked away. That sentence struck me harder than I expected, because I knew something about love. Love wasn't just words. My parents had sacrificed for me. My mother had stayed awake when I was sick. My father had worked long hours so I could have opportunities he never had. Love had always involved sacrifice, and suddenly I understood why the cross had such emotional power for Christians. I didn't want emotion to replace truth, so I kept asking questions. I asked Christian friends difficult questions. I asked Muslim friends difficult questions. I read arguments from both sides. And sometimes I became frustrated. There were days when I felt more confused than ever. One night I sat on the floor of my apartment surrounded by books. I was exhausted and looked upward. "God," I whispered, "why is this so difficult?" Then I began crying. I wasn't crying because I wanted to convert. I was crying because I wanted certainty. I wanted someone to hand me a simple answer, but faith doesn't always work that way. Sometimes the journey forces you to confront yourself. I realized that I wasn't only asking, "Who is Jesus?" I was also asking, "Who am I?" What did I really believe? Did I believe because questioning was uncomfortable? Or had I personally examined my faith? That question frightened me, because suddenly I realized that sincere faith requires honesty. I went back to the beginning. I studied Jesus' Jewish background. I studied the historical setting. I learned about the world in which he lived. I learned how different groups understood the Messiah. I read Christian interpretations of his identity. I read Islamic interpretations of his identity. And something became increasingly clear. Both traditions regarded Jesus as extraordinarily important. Neither treated him as an ordinary man. Both recognized his connection to Mary. Both regarded him as a sign from God. Both spoke about his miracles. But they interpreted his identity and mission differently. That distinction mattered. I wasn't going to pretend the differences didn't exist. But I also realized something else. I had spent years hearing people argue about Jesus without actually listening to Jesus' teachings. So I returned to them, again and again. It happened on a Friday night. I had been reading alone. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. The apartment was quiet. I came across the words of Jesus about loving God and loving one's neighbor. I stopped. I had read those teachings before, but suddenly they felt personal. I thought about people I had forgiven, and people I hadn't. People I secretly resented, people I judged, people I had ignored because their problems were inconvenient. Then I remembered something my father used to say, "Your religion should make you a better human being." I closed my eyes, and I realized that I had been treating faith like a debate. Who is right? Who is wrong? Which doctrine wins? Which argument is stronger? But Jesus' teachings were confronting a different question. What kind of person are you becoming? That question broke through my defenses. I began to cry, not because I had solved theology, but because I realized I needed God more than I needed to win an argument. For a long time I had believed that discovering something about Jesus meant choosing a side in a religious argument. Christian versus Muslim, Bible versus Quran, prophet versus Son of God. But slowly, I discovered that my journey wasn't really about defeating another religion. It was about seeking God honestly, and Jesus became impossible for me to dismiss as simply a name from history. His life demanded a response. I understood why Christians centered their faith around him. I understood why his words had comforted people for centuries. I understood why people prayed in his name. I understood why the cross was sacred to them. And I also understood why his identity had been debated for generations. There was one thing, however, that became deeply personal. Jesus had taught people to seek God with their whole heart. And that was exactly what I was doing. I didn't suddenly become a different person overnight. There was no dramatic thunder, No voice from heaven. No crowd witnessing my decision. There was simply a young woman sitting alone in an apartment in America, holding a Bible, with tears on her face. And for the first time, I understood that seeking truth requires humility. That was the question Sarah eventually asked me. We were sitting together several months after my journey began. I smiled. I knew you were going to ask that. She laughed. So? I took a deep breath. I've discovered that Jesus is much more than the simple picture I had in my head. She waited. I thought I knew him because I knew one sentence about him. Jesus was a prophet. I paused. But now I understand why Christians believe he is the Messiah, and why his life, death, and resurrection are at the center of their faith. She nodded. And what do you believe? I looked down. That question is still complicated for me. She smiled. That's okay. And that answer surprised me. I expected pressure. Instead, she gave me patience. She told me that faith wasn't supposed to be forced. She said that God knew my heart better than anyone. That night, I went home and prayed again, but my prayer was different. I didn't ask God to give me the answer I wanted. I said, God, if Jesus is who Christians say he is, give me the courage to accept that truth. And if I have misunderstood anything, guide me. Don't let pride stand between me and you. That became the most honest prayer of my life. So what did I discover? Did I discover that Jesus was simply a prophet? No, at least not in the simple way I had always understood him. I discovered that the Christian understanding of Jesus was far deeper and more profound than I had ever allowed myself to investigate. I discovered a Jesus who called people to repentance, a Jesus who spoke constantly about God, a Jesus who taught forgiveness, a Jesus who loved people society had rejected, a Jesus who challenged religious hypocrisy, a Jesus whose suffering became the center of Christian hope. And most importantly, I discovered why Christians didn't merely admire him, they trusted him. They worshipped God through him. They saw his life as God's answer to humanity's deepest problem, separation from him. Whether someone agrees with every Christian doctrine or not, I believe one thing is impossible to deny. Jesus deserves to be taken seriously, not as a character in an argument, not as a symbol, not as a name we casually mention, but as a person whose life has challenged humanity for 2,000 years. The hardest conversation was with my mother. I sat across from her at the kitchen table. She could tell something was different. You've been thinking a lot. Yes. About Jesus? I nodded. She became quiet. I was nervous. Then she reached across the table and held my hand. What have you learned? I told her everything. Not every detail, but enough. I told her that I had read the Bible, that I had spoken with Christians, that I had studied both perspectives, that I had cried, that I had prayed, that I had been confused, and that I had discovered a depth to Jesus that I had never understood before. She listened. When I finished, she said, whatever you believe, never stop seeking God sincerely. I started crying. Are you angry? No. Why? Because questioning sincerely is different from rejecting God. She squeezed my hand. I realized something beautiful. A person's faith journey can be complicated without destroying love between people. For years I thought faith meant having every question answered. I thought certainty meant never having doubts. But now I see it differently. Faith doesn't mean pretending you have no questions. It means having the courage to seek truth, even when questions are uncomfortable. I had spent months looking for proof, but what I found was something deeper. I found humility. I found compassion. I found a renewed desire to pray. I found myself caring more about how I treated people. I stopped seeing Christians as simply the other side. They were people, people searching, people struggling, people praying, people carrying grief, people hoping, and I realized that Jesus' teachings had pushed me toward compassion rather than contempt. That mattered. I still have the notebook. The first page says, "Who was Jesus?" Underneath are dozens of questions. Some have answers, some don't. But the final page contains only one sentence. I wrote it after months of searching. It says, I came looking for an argument and found a person. That person was Jesus. I began this journey thinking he was a distant prophet from history. Then I opened the gospel accounts. I studied his teachings. I learned what Christians believed. I questioned everything. I prayed, I cried, I doubted, I searched again. And somewhere along the way, Jesus stopped being merely a theological question. He became the person at the center of my search for God. Maybe you're a Christian, maybe you're Muslim, maybe you're Jewish, maybe you believe nothing at all, maybe you've walked away from religion, maybe you're sitting alone tonight asking questions you are afraid to tell anyone about. If that's you, I want to tell you something. Don't be afraid to seek. Don't be afraid of honest questions. Don't be afraid to open a book. Don't be afraid to listen to someone who believes differently. And don't be afraid to pray, God, show me the truth. Because sometimes the most important journey in life begins with a question we are afraid to ask. My journey began with one. Who was Jesus? I thought I already knew the answer. I thought he was simply a prophet. But then I discovered the Christian story of Jesus, the Messiah, the suffering Savior, and the risen Lord, and I finally understood why billions of people have built their lives around him. I discovered that Jesus wasn't someone I could understand through a single sentence. He had to be encountered through his teachings, his story, his suffering, and the claims made about his life. And the more I searched, the more I realized something that changed me forever. Sometimes God doesn't give us the answer before we begin the journey. Sometimes he gives us the courage to take the first step. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The apartment was quiet. I walked to the window. The sky was beginning to brighten. For a moment, I thought about the woman I had been before this journey. She wanted certainty. She wanted easy answers. She wanted faith without questions. I smiled. I wasn't that woman anymore. I still had questions, but I wasn't afraid of them. I opened my notebook. On the final page, beneath the sentence I had written, I added one more line. And sometimes the greatest discovery isn't learning that you were right. It's discovering that you were willing to be wrong. I closed the notebook. Then I prayed. Not because someone forced me. Not because I was afraid. Not because I wanted to win a religious debate. I prayed because after months of searching, I had finally understood what I had been looking for all along. I wasn't merely looking for information about Jesus. I was looking for God. And perhaps that is why his story had followed me for so long. Because sometimes the question we think is about someone else is actually a question about ourselves. Who is Jesus? That question changed my life, and I don't think I will ever stop searching for the answer.